Welcome to Union Talk and Happy Black History Month. I'm your host, Randi Weingarten, and today we have one of the most special segments that we've had, which is dedicated to Bayard Rustin. Yes, he is someone that many of us at the AFT have known for generations. But more important than that, he embodies the spirit, and this film depicts his spirit, the spirit of an angelic troublemaker, the spirit of someone who had to hide so much of who he was and still found ways, particularly in the envisioning and the execution of the March on Washington, to be hugely consequential in not only Black history, but in American history. And so what we want to do today is we are doing this podcast in the 24-hour period that we have our AFT Executive Council, and we have members in this audience from the NAACP, from the AFT, from the Albert Shanker Institute, from the Image Awards, people from Netflix. We got a lot of people in the room. But today, what we really want to do is actually talk to some people who knew Bayard personally, as well as people who were so involved in the film and the screenwriting of the film, and really kind of pull the curtain back a little bit about the man and about who he was and how he became such a consequential leader of our movement and so consequential for the AFT as well. So it's a little different than the way others have looked at Rustin, but what I would hope is that anybody who listens to the podcast, there's lots of screenings. We'll be doing some more screenings as well as the AFT. Watch this film. Watch this film. Watch this film. So, the panel. Dr. Lorretta Johnson is the Secretary-Treasurer Emeritus of the AFT. For anyone who knows her, I don't have to speak about her legendary nature because you know who she is. She's a civil rights leader, she's a labor organizer, she starts from Baltimore, Maryland, and she served as an AFT Vice President for over 30 years. And she served as our treasurer for the AFT for 9 years. But most importantly, she created huge opportunity for paraprofessionals and support personnel in her home state, her beloved state of Maryland, and throughout the country. Thank you, Lorretta, for being here. I'm going to introduce Rachelle last. We have with us, to my immediate left, for people who are in the room, Clayola Brown, who has served as the president of A. Philip Randolph Institute since 2004. This was the organization that was founded by Bayard, and Bayard served as its first president, named for the iconic labor leader, A. Philip Randolph, who Bayard knew very well and who worked closely with Bayard. What Clay has done with the A. Philip Randolph Institute is it's not simply an institute that remembers, but it's an institute that acts over and over again to ensure that we have equity in this nation, which is getting harder and harder, but the kind of work that the A. Philip Randolph Institute has done in terms of getting out the vote and the engagement with communities across the country is pretty remarkable. I love that Clayola is here with us today. Thank you, Clay. There is never a movie without a screenwriter. Writers bring movies to life. And we are really honored that the author of the original screenplay for Rustin, Julian Breece, is here with us today. He is an award-winning, Emmy-nominated writer, and we need to have this shout-out to our fellow siblings in the Writers Guild. Thank you, Julian, for this movie and for being here today.
Yes.
I told you I would introduce Rachelle last, so let me also introduce, just like you can't have a movie without a writer, movies don't get produced without fantastic producers. And we have one of the best here. And he is a brilliant storyteller. He's an Oscar-winning filmmaker. He's made a whole bunch of other films that elevate the stories of LGBTQ plus folks. It's been a cornerstone of his work. Films like Milk, To Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, and American Beauty. And now, frankly, I think it's your best, Bruce Rustin. So I want to introduce Bruce Cohen. Thank you. And last is someone who, for those of us in AFT world, frankly needs no introduction. Just like Lorretta needs no introduction in the AFT world. But it is really a great honor to have Rachelle Horowitz with us tonight. Now, Rachelle, this is what I'm supposed to say about her. She's a veteran organizer. She's an incredible strategist. She lent her voice and her moxie and her blood, sweat, and tears to the civil rights movement in the 50s, 60s, 70s. She worked directly, as anyone who sees the film knows, directly with Bayard. She will tell you she was pretty accurately depicted in the film. The March on Washington would not have happened without her. But what she also has done is that she lent all of that smarts and all of that strategy to the AFT afterwards. Al Shanker had the brilliant idea to bring Rachelle in as political director for the AFT. And frankly, the AFT would not be where it is today without Rachelle Horowitz. She was the brilliant strategist that helped create the kind of foundational work that we now build off of. And so to see her depicted in the role that she had in the march, that she and Sandy would talk about over drinks for all those years since that time, it's pretty remarkable to bring that history forward with the focus on what we need to do today and tomorrow. So, thank you all of you for joining us tonight. I want to start with Julian and Bruce for a minute, because many of us know the history, but like, why did you decide to do this film? You have lifted him up in a way that is beautiful and in a way that where his memory can no longer be reduced to a footnote. So why'd you decide to do it?
It had to be done. It had to be done. I think, for me, my journey with Bayard and his story started when I was young, when I grew up in Washington, D.C. I grew up, went to school very close. I went to Jefferson Junior High School, Banneker High School. Jefferson was very close to the monument grounds. We would have celebrations every year about the March on Washington. I thought I knew everything about the March on Washington. And when I learned about Bayard, I was about 13 years old. And it was a time in my life when I was just sort of coming to terms with the fact that this gay thing was not just a phase, that it was gonna stick around. And I was just looking for other signs of life out there, Black gay men whose lives showed there were positive outcomes for men like me. And there was an activist and writer, Keith Boykin, who had a blog where he would document queer histories. Black queer histories, and one of those was Bayard Rustin. And the thing that struck me immediately about Bayard's story was his relationship with King. So here you have the most celebrated religious leader, religious figure in modern history, who was mentored by this brilliant Black gay man, mentored, friend. This is the person who introduced him to, nonviolent philosophy. And I couldn't believe, the thing that he's known the most for. So that changed me in that moment, just with reading that on the internet. And obviously, I learned a lot more about him, through college. Then, when the movie opportunity came along, I found out that Dustin Lance Black was going to be developing a film about Bayard Rustin. At the time, I was temping in LA. I'd come out here for film school. I really had not made a dime in the industry, but I had written a couple of fancy screenplays that were okay, but they won some fancy awards, and so I had representation, but hadn't gotten a gig yet. And when my manager told me about this, that this was happening, I was like, it has to be me. I was like, I want to be a part of it. And I think the reason why I wanted to be a part of it is because, I don't know, I felt like I felt a closeness to him, and I just wanted to make sure that there were certain parts of his story that were protected and respected, not exploited. Also, I think the most important thing that I did learn through my research about Bayard, and I think is really important in this time now of focus on individuals, the influencer, the billionaire, is that as much as the movie and Bayard's story is about him, his message is always about the collective. Yeah. And so for me going into the movie, I think that I knew that that was important. It was as much about Bayard Rustin as it was a love letter to organizers and the people who worked with him, because that is who he lifted up. Bayard was not about me. And so, I sent Lance a long email, stalked him. My manager, stalked him and told him how much Bayard meant to me. And we met. He was familiar with the short film that I had done, and we hit it off. And that was my first job in as a feature screenwriter in the industry 10 years ago, mind you. Sorry, it was 2013. So it took 10 years for it to actually get made. That was when it all started for me.
Well, let me start just by saying, and I'm just going to speak for Julian and I here for a moment, how honored we are to be a part of this. One of the great joys and incredible rewards of getting to do films like this about real people is that you then get to meet the living history behind them. And I've been very fortunate to have a deep connection to Randy through Sharon and a deep connection to Rachelle through my dad, who we may hear a little bit about later. But so I already were in awe of you two, but to meet Lorretta and Clayola, these icons of activism, just bursting with pride and gratefulness to be here in the space with the four of you amazing women. I had seen a documentary about Bayard Rustin. There's a great documentary about him called Brother Outsider that I had seen in the 90s. And so I knew who Bayard was and knew that not enough other people did. And I had worked with Lance Black on Milk, and he had mentioned to me at some point that he was working on a screenplay for Rustin, and I said, oh my goodness, please, if you ever get the urge to send that to me. That's something that I'd love to be a part of. And he sent me the screenplay that he and Julian had worked on. And I immediately had the sense that it would be a calling to try and get the film made. And one of the things that Bayard Rustin had in common with Harvey Milk is that when we started making the Milk film, no one knew who Harvey was. It's one of the lasting legacies of the film is that not entirely the movie, but the movie played a large part in changing that. People know who Harvey Milk is now. He's got a postage stamp. He's got a terminal named after him in San Francisco. He's got an aircraft carrier, and he's taught in history books. And none of us should rest until the same thing is true of Bayard Rustin.
Could he have an antique African art instead of an aircraft carrier? He was a pacifist.
Exactly. I think that's the sacred mission of the film and moving forward is that people will know who Bayard Rustin is and that his legacy will last and he will not get lost in history. And when Afterland sent me the script and I came on board to produce, as I was taking the script around Hollywood, we were learning the full extent of how absolutely no one knew who this man was. And I do remember thinking, well, I know one person who knows who Bayard Rustin is, and the person I was thinking of is the person that had presented Bayard Rustin with the Presidential Medal of Freedom on the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and that was, at the time, President Barack Obama. And in a beautiful twist of fate, the Obamas had opened their production company at Netflix to make film and television about a month before I had gotten the script. So I thought, I'm going to send this to the Obamas, and sent it to Tonya Davis, who runs the company there, and they were looking for their first film. And when Tonya had the meeting, which she thought it was going to be the beginning of a long process to help them decide which of many movies they might make for their first film, when she mentioned Rustin, President Obama said, well, that's our first movie right there.
So the other three people on the panel, they, in different ways, Bayard is not a historical artifact to them. They knew the man, and they worked with him. And so I just want, who am I to call on these three women who are all my mentors? These are all people who knew Bayard intimately. So the question I have for you, Rachelle, first is, how did you meet? And how did you get into being the transportation director of the March on Washington?
I was a young radical socialist, and I was a 16-year-old hippie, and I went to school with somebody named Tom Kahn, who's in the movie, and we thought we were going to change the world. I mean, we were going to make revolutions, I don't know where, but certainly we made a revolution in Hungary, we made a revolution in Czechoslovakia, we made a lot of revolutions in our heads and in a small room on 14th Street. And then Michael Harrington, who wrote The Other America, at one point said to both of us, why don't you go up to this office on West 57th Street and help Bayard Rustin, who's working on the Montgomery protest. And Tom Kahn and I walked into an office. One part of it was as big as this podium, and there was a little office on the side. And in that room was Bayard Rustin and Ella Baker. They had an organization called In Friendship, and it was in friendship with the Montgomery bus. We were not calling it boycott yet. We were calling it protest to make it legal, and they were raising money. And one of our first jobs, because there was going to be a rally with Jackie Robinson speaking, but 50,000 leaflets had been printed with the wrong date, was to take pens and change Wednesday to Thursday. And Bayard and Ella Baker would sit there, and we would all go Wednesday to Thursday. And into this office would come other volunteers, people Bob Moses, who was a hero in the civil rights movement, and other people. And Bayard, I think, knew he had to keep us interested because we wouldn't come back, but also he was an absolutely born teacher. So what he did is sometimes he sang freedom songs. Sometimes he told Con and me what to read about being black. He was always doing something, but every few minutes, either Ella or Bayard would run into the back office and they would say, Martin's on the phone. And they would go and they would talk to Martin Luther King. And I had somebody, and they made a decision that somebody had to go south. Dr. King was in Montgomery. He was, I think, 27 years old. I mean, it was his first church. He was discovering himself. They foisted him into the leadership of the Montgomery protests because he was the new guy in town, so that people didn't have anything about him. And of course, when people heard him preach, they knew there was something going on. So Ella was to go south. So there we are. And Con and I and Moses and other people became members of the Bayard Rustin Marching Society. Anyway, the real point that I really want to get to is Bayard and Al Shanker. Bayard not only took on in the film world every dangerous question, but he was an incredibly courageous man, physically and intellectually. Ocean Hill-Brownsville was a disastrous event in New York City. Somebody quickly tell me the year.
67, 68.
67, 68. A group of activists in Ocean Hill-Brownsville came up with a concept of community control as opposed to due process unions. It was a very militant and attractive sounding slogan, as a lot of slogans are, community control. And Al at first sort of negotiated. He tried to negotiate, the negotiations fell through, and ultimately teachers were fired in Ocean Hill-Brownsville without due process. They were just kicked out. And there came a fight of, do you defend them or not? AFT Randolph, when Bayard went to him and told him what was going on, Mr. Randolph just said, are my brothers and sisters not getting due process in the union? Bayard said, no. They said, what's the problem? We have to support them. Bayard tried to explain that Jimmy Baldwin, every sort of black non-trade unionist in the city, was supporting community control. By the way, if you ask any of them today, they'll tell you community control was a disaster. Those of you who knew Al Shanker and heard Al Shanker know he was a little abrupt and brusque. And he'd say something that really you shouldn't say. So what he said during Ocean Hill-Brownsville was, I'm against mob control. Well, every black person within sight shuddered at that. And I must say, Bayard ran down, we were then to Al's office and said to him, you cannot say that. When you say that, you offend me. And I don't even know whether Bayard had to explain to Al what he meant. But the fact of the matter is, Al listened and took it seriously. And what remains from that incident is the depth of their friendship. In the campaign to organize, to get collective bargaining for the AFT, Al went to jail, and Bayard had a collection from various people for money to bail Al out. And obviously it's a symbolic collection, but a check came from Martin Luther King, a check which, by the way, some of you may know, Al never cashed, and which he had in his wallet his whole life. So there was a historic relationship.
Many times in kind of talkbacks of the movie right now, there's a lot of focus on Bayard's sexuality and how that stopped him or kept him, and you see that in the movie, kind of pulled him back from the leadership. He couldn't speak at the march. There were several leaders who wanted him not to be involved. Part of the brilliance of this panel is that you see Bayard as a trade unionist and as the activist who actually helped create a generation of trade unionists. So as someone who, came in the 80s, what I heard was a lot of these stories. To finish Rachelle's story on Ocean Hill, Brownsville, both Sandy, who was then the president of the UFT, before she became the president of the AFT, and myself and others, we wanted to heal the scars of Ocean Hill. Herb Daughtry and Reverend Al Sharpton walked into the new AFT, then new building at 52 Broadway, and they said, as we were planning a strike, yes, illegal, but a strike nonetheless, against the city of New York and Michael Bloomberg, and they said in front of a huge crowd of people, we weren't with you in 1968, but we are with you now. The end of it was that we worked on the relationships for all of those years. But one of the through lines, and this is where I want to get to, is that Clay and Lorretta and Rachelle and Sandy and Arthur Barnes and so many others, we were not going to let others divide our communities. And we ultimately, and this is, I want to, in Bayard's tradition, Lorretta and Clay and others in New York, I don't know if Anthony Harmon is here, Hazel Dukes, we worked at it. We were not going to let anyone divide these historic communities, labor and civil rights community, to divide us. And I want to just turn to the two of you because you have been part of this, and Rachelle is, shaking her head. You've been part of this as we not only healed those rifts, but actually fought to make these communities, our communities, closer.
Well, I'll pick up from there. Barbara Van Blake, who was our Civil and Human Rights chair, introduced me to Bayard Rustin. I was an activist in AFT, back home, BTU. Barbara was an activist in our own home, Duval County. She had produced in Duval County what Bayard had been teaching, how the community and the union could work together and make a difference in the political world. Barbara was president of the A. Philip Randolph, but she also was a union member. She was a teacher in Duval County. But every politician came to the A. Philip Randolph for support and get out to vote. And when I went down there to work for AFT to help out, I met Barbara. And Barbara was a teacher, president of the A. Philip Randolph, and put together such a strong program and elected school board members, elected city council persons in that district, and they had no collective bargaining rights, but Duval County had them because the people that they put in supported them. And then Al hired Barbara as chair. I became a vice president and became chair of the Civil and Human Rights Department. And she introduced me to Bayard. Bayard was a very strong man. I got the opportunity through Bayard to meet Mr. Randolph. I went to Mr. Randolph's apartment and for 2 hours heard the story, his life story of what he did on the sleeping car porters, and how he worked and what came, and how this institution, the A. Philip Randolph, we were nonpartisan, and he was very clear. I could hear his voice now when he said it. We're not Democrat and we're not Republicans. We're going to be nonpartisan, but we're going to have our people out to vote, and we're going to educate them. I got hooked, and I went back home. I've been president of the A. Philip Randolph in Baltimore for 45 years. Bayard was a thinker, a strategist with me. I remember the Institute was run mostly by the people who gave the money. They were all on the board. Al Shanker was treasurer. UAW president was somebody else. CWA was sitting up there. And all of us, and I was one of the leaders, we presidents of our chapters back home, well, we don't have enough to say about this board. And how come they making all the decisions for us when we go to the conference? We don't have a convention because we're not a union. We're a nonpartisan organization, so we have a conference every year. But we was feeling like it was a union because we were there fussing. So Bayard said to me, look, Lorretta, I'm tired of you coming up here every year talking this same trash to me. And I'm not going to tell you what he said because he cussed a lot. So he said, we're going to come up with an idea of how we can settle this. He came up with setting up a regional structure. Yes. And from that region, each person that we put up to represent us, north, east, south, west, would be on the board and be a board member. Well, we all grinning now. We all had something to say. So we have a regional structure. We couldn't have a union structure. We don't elect our officers. This was Bayard at work. And he did it in a way. And at the night at the awards banquet when he said, all of you that's been complaining to me, I hope you're feeling good because you've been on my goddamn nerves for years. The concept of what Bayard did, I didn't know it early on when I came to the march in 1963 when they coordinated, was a part of community versus union. They had a union guy, Mr. Bradley, who put the buses out there for us to come to Washington. And when I got to meet Bayard, I was so in awe that I was meeting the guy who put that together. And then one of my mentors over here, when I came into AFT, Rachelle Horowitz, I found out later that she was the one that did the coordination. So I was in my world. And continuing the effort, I'm so happy that I can be a part of this movie and the fact that Bayard is now being identified for the work he did.
Because what you're hearing here in Rachelle and in Lorretta and in Clay, you're hearing a living history that we may not ever again have the opportunity to do. And I think it's important to dwell on it in Black History Month, which is American history. If we don't tell these oral histories of who we are and what has happened, we're not going to have it to tell. And so that is why I am dwelling on it and why this podcast may be longer than many of the others that we do. So Clay.
Thank you, Randy. Let me first say to all of you, I sit here absolutely in awe of having first been invited to be a part of this discussion, and I thank you, President Weingarten, for doing just that.
When did you ever call me President
Well,
Weingarten?
we out in public. I was trying to be proper, goddamn it. I tell you what, Randy has been a friend, and AFT has been longstanding, as you heard from the history from the speakers before me, for the A. Philip Randolph Institute, because there were times when we didn't have a place to stay. And Sandy Felder, you know what I'm talking about, Anthony. Sandy Felder came through across the park and said, well, why are you worrying so much? We didn't go anywhere. UFT is still here, AFT is still here, and you've got a home as long as we are. And that was years later. But let me go back just a little bit, because although my sisters are so beautiful and they speak so well, I was 15 when I first got the bite. 15 years old, living in Philadelphia with my uncle and my aunt, because my mom didn't want me to go back to South Carolina to finish high school. We had just gotten, my dad was in the Navy, just gotten transferred back to the East Coast and was headed for South Carolina. In the house with my aunt, who I could not stand at all. And she deserved for me not to stand her, because she was a mean, old, hateful woman. But my uncle, who was just such a straightforward man, proud of his dignity, and taught me to understand the importance of being Black and proud at the same time, was an encouragement to me. But I would sneak and listen to a station from Philadelphia, WDAS, on the radio at night. And there was a DJ, Georgie Woods, who would do the talking at the time. And he was talking about this march that was going to happen in Washington, D.C. And I heard them playing snippets of this resonating voice of Asa Philip Randolph. And he had that deep baritone that just sounded like you want to do something special just because you heard him, right? It sounded like the voice of God from the movies, right? But then you heard Dr. King, and you heard all of these other voices that at 15, I was like, I gotta go. Now, I came up during the time when your signal for being in the house was a street light. If you wasn't in that house by the time that light started to come on, you knew that you were gonna meet either the hand, the belt, or the shoe coming through the door, plain and simple. And my aunt loved for me to be late, but anyway, I digress. But when I heard those voices, I knew that I didn't really have an option, because there was something about the pride and the dignity that came from just listening to the voices that made you want to do some stuff. Yeah. And they gave the date, and they gave the location, and I didn't have no money, but I knew I was going to get from Philadelphia to Washington some kind of way. And on faith, I was able to put together babysitting money to get a Greyhound ticket, Greyhound bus. So y'all know what that is, right? To get to Washington, D.C. Got on the bus, and the one thing that I knew, if you saw a sister with a greasy brown bag, you are right. Because in that bag was some chicken, some pound cake, somebody had a jar of Kool-Aid somewhere. And it wasn't with all the fancy names. It was either grape or red. And if you were smart, you sat next to those folks with them greasy bags. So I waited until my uncle went to work that morning, because he worked for PSE&G. And when he left, my aunt was lazy. She would lay in the bed and tell me what I had to do around the house. But I digress one more time. I promise I won't do it no more. But when he left, I left. I went down to that Greyhound bus station, took that bus to Washington, D.C., found me a sister with a greasy bag, sat next to her, ate so well, all the way to Washington, and got there and didn't know what the heck I was going to do. It was the most amazing sight I had ever seen in my entire life. A sea of people like you could not believe, of all colors, shapes, and sizes. And you had to have this tassel-y label thing from the church that you were traveling with or from the organization that you were traveling with in order to gain access to the main space. You know what I'm talking about. Both of y'all do. I didn't have nothing except a greasy mouth at that time. But I wasn't alone because there were other folks that were 14, 15, and 16 that had taken a chance. And I started looking up in the trees. And that's where we got the name from, the bird children. Because we couldn't go down to see, but there were some awesome trees that we could climb and see the faces and hear the voices and all the speeches as they were being made. And that was the awesomeness that started for me at 15, to know that there was work to be done and I had to be a part of it. I got a chance to see Rustin. And oh my God, he did not speak as Randy was talking about earlier, but you could tell he was running stuff. He had this board, clipboard. You know what I'm talking about? And he had maybe a gazillion pencils stuck a little bit everywhere. You could see how he was grabbing pencils and whatever as he was directing folks all across everywhere. I was like, that man is magical. And I watched how all of the others with big names and reputations were looking at him and listening to what he had to say. But he never got in front of a camera. He never picked up a microphone to do anything. He just made it happen. And as I listened to a very young Dr. King talk about why we had to be there, and as I watched Randolph standing in his magnificent way, I was like, Lord Jesus, I got to do something with this. And then the time came to go home and get on the bus and go back to my aunt's house. By this time, everyone had been worried and scared about what had happened. My uncle didn't talk to me. He just gave me the whipping that I expected. My mother was doing sleep-in work in New York because my dad was going back out to sea. So I knew I was going to get another one when she came to Philly to find out what had happened. I got that second whipping. But that very next summer, she took me down to South Carolina because by then a house was built. And I had an opportunity to work on my first real organizing campaign. And in that organizing campaign, at a place called Manhattan Shirt Factory, there were those same kinds of voices, the same kinds of struggles being talked about. And those men were being lifted in those conversations, so I knew I had found a home. The labor movement was what I wanted to do. Later, I found out it was UAW who paid for the sound system so that we could hear. Say it again.
And the ILGWU.
My parent union, the ILGWU, provided the stands and the podiums and a few of the microphones. UAW had a little bit more money than ILGWU. They had those great big old microphones, we call them speakers, that were all over everywhere. And I watched the unity between community and the labor movement and the religious sector. And it became real. I was used to preachers hollering at me. I mean, because they knew how to make you jump up and holler hallelujah in a heartbeat. But these were trade unions, organizers and strategists who could do the very same thing. And it was amazing to see the young people there. I was not an outsider at 15 and 16. I was recruited at that age by the message that got taught. And I never forgot it. Because then, as I became an adult, this woman that I'm sitting next to came to me and said, we need you at the APRI. I didn't know Lorretta from a hole in the stump. But Lorretta talked to me about names and people that I had seen as a teenager and idolized. And then I met Barbara Van Blake, who she called Black Black. And I was being taught in a formalized way how to organize the thoughts. I got to meet folks from the AFT who made school and other kinds of structured organizations a place to do the kinds of things that you got a chance to see a Rustin do, to hear a Randolph talk about. And it was, again, establishing what home was. Then I met this one right here, who started yelling at me again about all the stuff that needed to be done. So the mix between the two movements and the one goal became so very clear. And it wasn't a choice. It was a calling that if you had ears and a heart, you knew what your next step had to be. But that's how I got to the movement.
So we're going to do one more quick round because it's getting late. But this is how I want to intervene on this. In this first round, what you see is the kind of intersection between the civil rights movement and the labor movement in a very, very granular way. And in some ways, Rachelle started in one, came to the other, and the friendships of all of the folks in Rachelle's circle and Barbara Van Blake's circle and Sandy's circle, the friendships were real and the work was even more real than the friendships. And the second kind of intersection here, which I found pretty foundational when I first got to the AFT, or the UFT, was that, gay people weren't really a thing that was recognized by the labor movement in the 1970s or the 1980s. Not really a thing. And Sandy would constantly talk about Bayard. It was kind of like hint, hint, you can talk to me about who you are. But the hiddenness of many of us who were gay and not out in the 70s. I mean, a teacher in the 70s, gay, a union person, it was just not, it was, you were going to be run out of the Corps. And what's been interesting, and that's why I kind of want to go through and say this in a very personal way, because I heard this from some of the gay men or queer black men in the movement right now, who still feel like, oh my God, I'm not accepted as I should be. The conversation we had today in our executive council about the non-binary person, trans person named Nex, who was effectively murdered, even if it wasn't right when they left the bathroom. Not accepted. But the last thing I'd say about this, before I get all of your impressions in a very, we'll have to do this quickly, but I want your sense, is that even with all of that, Bayard was relegated to a back seat. Women were relegated to a back seat in the march too. You see that in the movie as well. But he understood what he needed to do, and he did it. And Reverend King understood what he needed to do and what Bayard needed to do, and he stood up. And I found that last moment of the film both familiar and empowering. And I see people in the room who are saying something similar to me. Familiar in that, oh no, yes, you this last moment in the film was the legacy now the legacy organizations, but the black leaders of those organizations, at the end of the film, say, we just got invited to the White House and we're going. And there's Bayard. They looked at Bayard and they were not inviting him.
That's right.
And Bayard was picking up the trash, had a big bag that he was picking up the trash, and he was with, several of the workers who were picking up the trash. And somebody said to him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Why are you picking up the trash?" And his statement was something like, "This is where I belong." With the workers, making sure that everything was back to where it needed to be. And that last moment of basically saying, I'm going to be with the workers.
That's right.
I am going to do this righteous work right now, to borrow a line that Bren and Richard said earlier. And I'm going to be lifting up this righteous work. And that moment was both familiar in terms of, no, you're not invited because you're gay. And Bayard basically turning it around.
That's right.
And saying, I am empowering everyone else. I still cry thinking about it. And so I guess there are some of us up on the stage who, were hidden and spent the beginning of our careers in that way, scared to death. And there are some of us on this stage who knew who Bayard was and completely accepted, and he accepted them, as you could hear. And so I just, in those last couple minutes, I kind of want to just get your kind of raw reactions to how you depicted it, Julian and Bruce, and to Rachelle, and to Lorretta, and to Clay, how you dealt with all these other folks who are like, how do you have a gay guy with you?
I never thought about it because he was the person he was. And he was a teacher. He was openly gay back then. He didn't hide it. So I didn't have an opinion except the person who he was and what he did. For example, he and Barbara Van Vleck went to Somalia and came back and spoke before Congress because of the drought and all of that. We worked with Bayard. We didn't see anything about him being gay because he let us know he was gay. He didn't hide it. And so it wasn't for me to make a decision about it. Yes, it was bad times. And it was times that people did say bad things. But my father taught me to respect everybody. And I always thought like that. God taught me stuff that I would never know without living it, and the way that he handled himself. I mean, Bayard wasn't an easy guy now. He didn't take no stuff off you. He was ready. If you were going to fight, he was ready for you. And so therefore, most of the people around that I knew respected him. And I certainly had no opinion at all, except I accepted him for who he was.
Can I do real quick here? Okay, because I know your stories are more in depth than mine. When I came to AFT Randolph Institute, and I will admit this publicly, and there's several of you from the organization that know that I'm telling the truth, there was very little talk about the LGBTQ community inside of our organization. I purposely started doing stuff just to get the reaction at first, because it made me crack up to see some folks going, how did she say that with my mouth? Because that was a part of our legacy, and we were not going to leave that out. I said that to say this. Now we have 13 LGBTQ chapters across this country. In North Carolina, of one of the places I wanted to mention, and they purposely call themselves the Rustin A. Philip Randolph Institute chapters. So I'm proud of that. And there is no hiding anything about who this institute is. And our folks, because Annie B. Martin used to look at me and say, go ahead and say it again. And we would do exactly that. All the criticism and everything that came with lifting it up, we took it because he had taken it before us. And now we can brag because across this organization of ours, everybody is represented and his legacy is being taught. So I wanted to do that real quick.
I want to say a word first for A. Philip Randolph. Just the way A. Philip Randolph said, it's a matter of collective bargaining, would swirl around him. Rumors, X is gay, your secretary's gay, Paulie Murray, who came out, is gay and worked for him. There was a trade unionist who came out of the ILGWU, very famous woman, gay. People would be whispering scandals. A. Philip Randolph didn't know anything about it. He just plowed through, and those people were never outside of his orbit and were never exiled. It is just a marvel of a man, and Bayard knew it and felt it. The other thing that I want to say about Bayard, not by the time of the Institute, but he had a famous saying. If somebody came to Bayard and said, would you join the ad hoc committee to save squirrels? I'm just making up a name. He would say, my dear, you know that I'm black. I was a member of the Young Communist League, and I'm a homosexual. Do you want me to do that? It was his, and he thought it was okay. And he was very clear about it, wonderful.
And I'll just add into the discussion that something I heard tonight, Lorretta, you mentioned it, it kept coming up in a very powerful way, is this coalition between the labor movement and the civil rights movement. And of course, Bayard Rustin put together the coalition that made the March on Washington exist, or it would never have happened with Rachelle's help and many others. And he says that line in the end of the film, you know, you either believe in freedom and justice for all or you do not, which reminded me exactly of the incredible Black activist Fannie Lou Hamer's line, nobody's free until everybody's free. And if we don't, all of us, double down on that and put the coalition together again that Bayard had for the march, we're in a heap of trouble in November and the whole thing could go to shit.
Right. So Julian, you get to bring us home.
Well, I mean, for me, I think that, first of all, this has just been such a privilege to be able to sit up here with, you know, the three of you, with the four of you, with all of you, the three of you who knew Bayard. And, you know, there would be no movie, this would not be the movie if I were not able to speak to people who worked with Bayard, who knew Bayard on a personal level. I did close to 20 hours of one-on-one interviews with people who worked with Bayard, who knew Bayard, like Rachelle, who sat down with me for about 9 hours.
You brought food.
I brought food. I did. Well, you learn. Well, and because at that point, I think, Rachelle, you would talk to a lot of people about different Bayard projects, different Bayard things. And, what I learned, this was my first biographical film. I have a research background. I thought I was going to go into academia. And then my thesis mentor said, I think you should be a creative writer. So that's when I went into screenwriting instead, because that's what I loved. But I love the research aspect. And there's only so much you can get sometimes in a history, a biography that you've read. And at the time, there was one really great biography. Forgot who the author of. Yes, D'Amelio. There was the documentary. But for a film, the personal story is everything. And I've written a few projects now about Black gay men, and learning about who they were personally is hard because there's just not a lot of documentation about it, because it's not something that they wrote about necessarily, or the people in their lives have been comfortable speaking about. But I needed that for this movie. I needed to know everything I'd read about Bayard, everything I'd learned about Bayard. He's strong. He is the most generous person that you've ever met. Brilliant, a genius, someone who, he knew how to command attention, all these things. And I'm like, all right, but I know he's human. And I think that the part of him that made him special, that is what I know is there. And I want to, what is it about him that made him who he was? And I had a theory, and I went in, being Black and gay is, everyone's experience is different. But I know that for me, realizing that I was not only a Black man in this country and all the challenges that are well documented that come with being a Black person in this country, being gay when I was younger felt impossible. There was no roadmap for it. There were just certain things as a young man that I didn't think were possible for my life. I limited myself, in my head, until I started to learn more about, other queer people. But I think the thing that scared a lot of us about coming out sometimes is that we didn't want to be seen as just gay. We didn't want that to take over our whole identity, because we're so much more than that.
That's right.
So going in and finding who Bayard was, Bayard's not just gay, but that is a piece of him that, unfortunately, because of the way that, because of homophobia, because of how it that functions in our society, it affects other parts of your life. It does, in good ways and bad ways. I've learned to look at it as a superpower. And what I learned through talking to Rachelle, through talking to his partner, Walter, especially, is that, W.B. Du Bois, he has his, theory of double consciousness that we have as Black people. We are able to see, society from with a macro vision. We're Black. We can see society more incisively. Let's put it that way. We can see how, it works from the outside because we've been pushed to the margins of it. With Bayard, he had a triple consciousness, right? He's pushed even further to the margins because of his sexuality. As a result, it really sharpens your ability to see what injustice is, right? What it looks like, how it functions, when you are pushed even further to the outside. It was also important for me to just get correct that when I went into it, there was no gay rights in 1963. This was a civil rights movie. And I think that was something that, at the time, I did get a little pushback on. There was no gay rights narrative then. There was no separation between who Bayard was as a gay man and who he was as a Black man, period. So, and the reality is that the story of civil rights, the civil rights story, and the story of, Black gay men, Black queer people, there was basically, before the civil rights movement, Black people were far more accepting of sexual variance than the white community, the larger, mainstream community. We were. That's just coming out of Reconstruction. There was acceptance of sexual variance. There were preachers who were lesbian. There were, preachers who were, who would cross-dress. The kind of pageantry that we see in churches that comes from, that's part of our history. Things changed for us as the civil rights movement started to take hold, because we had to prove we had to prove that we were able to embrace and adopt white patriarchal norms, right? And aggressive homophobia is one of those things, right? Misogyny first, which goes into, not misogyny, but, just male supremacy, right? And then, homophobia. So there were certain things, certain parts of ourselves that we had to push out of the way. The aggressive respectability politics of the movement, really, it pushed a lot of us further and further into the closet, as opposed to just the open secret, which is what we had in the Black community. So Bayard existed through that change. So he saw how that, what that looked like for us. And I mean, that was something that was important for me to get in the movie, is that there was no separation between who Bayard was as a Black man and a gay man. Also, he was out and gay, but because he was principled in this idea of truth, right? He believed in truth over everything. Anything that went against the truth was violence. And so how can I not live that? How can I not live, if I believe that every human being should be treated with dignity, if I believe in truth, then how can I lie about how I feel, right? So it wasn't the gay pride as we know it now. So the bravery that he had, and again, Walter Nagel really helped me, glean this, is there was that truth, there was that courage. You have this Black gay man who was out in the 40s, 50s, 60s, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have the same scars that closeted Black gay men had. One of the narratives that I really wanted to, counteract about Bayard, was that Bayard did not have close camaraderie with other Black gay men who were in the movement, but also, who were may have been closeted, and he did. And that just was not really been on the record. The reality is that it was not just Bayard who was gay at that time working in the movement. And Bayard actually was a safe haven for a lot of those men and women. And ultimately, the one thing I will say about this film is that this film would not be the film that it is if it were not, I feel like, protected by certain forces. 2013 is when I started researching it. The same year that Barack Obama gave Bayard Rustin posthumously the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which meant everything. I was like, oh my gosh, this means, this is gonna happen, this movie, everyone's gonna know about Bayard. At the time, the movie was set up at another place. It looked like it was gonna go forward. There was, it was another director who was a Black gay man who, really protected the script. Then when the project moved, with Lance and Bruce to George, it was protected. I didn't know when I wrote the film that one of the producers of the film would be one of the, not just one of the, top, gay producers in Hollywood, one of the top producers in Hollywood. Wow. It does not get, more prestigious, more than Bruce Cohen.
Yeah, that's right.
And It doesn't. I think that for me, I was scared that there were certain things that were going to be ripped out of the story, right? Or that were going to be changed. I went into it with a pure heart of portraying Bayard as the people who I talked to, which recollections vary. So everyone's idea is not necessarily going to be the idea that came together. But ultimately, like, I think that what did come together was of the kind of collaborative spirit that Bayard was about, and it was protected by people that cared about this story and what it meant to them. And, Bruce, deserves so much credit for protecting the film, for protecting the filmmaker, for, and obviously Higher Ground as well, you guys' partnership. I just want to thank you because we did not get to work together, because, this is in Hollywood, things happen. It takes 10 years for a film to get made. It's a collaborative process. It changes hands, especially as a writer. You don't know what it's going to look like by the time it makes it to the screen. I was so emotional when I saw the film for the first time, when I saw George's first cut, because I knew that it was something that I felt that the people who I had talked to would be able to be proud of. And that's the thing that was the scariest for me going into writing it, because those people meant something to me.
I just want to say at the end what our audience has been privy to right now is a real discussion about who Bayard was in all of his aspects, from people who knew him and from people who studied him and from people who honored him, from the labor movement, from the civil rights movements, and also through a 2010 through 2024 lens where we still see the oppression of the other.
That's right.
And whether the other is someone who's a black man, or whether the other is a Jewish socialist from Brooklyn, or whether the other are people from the labor movement, or whether the other are people who are gay and still struggling to be viewed equally in the eyes of others. Today, in 2024, we're starting to have some of those same fights, as Bruce just said, in this country that stem from the fear of the other. And I just want to honor all of you, because this podcast's name was We Were There to Rustin with Love. What you heard tonight was real, honest, unvarnished history and reflections about Bayard the man, Bayard the civil rights leader, Bayard the friend. We didn't talk about Bayard the singer. Bayard the labor activist, Bayard the humanist, and Bayard the freaking amazing organizer.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Bruce and Clay and Julian and Lorretta and Rachelle. Thank you for joining us tonight to give life to Bayard Rustin.